5 iridescent eggs that seemed to pulse with an inner light. That's what James McKinnon discovered nestled in his morning harvest. While his fellow farmers laughed and called him delusional for nurturing them in his greenhouse, James couldn't shake the feeling these weren't from any creature known to their lands. 6 weeks later, what emerged from those eggs left even seasoned biologists speechless and brought tears streaming down James's weathered face as he realized he'd been protecting something truly miraculous. For James McKinnon, the land was more than just his livelihood. It was his legacy, carved from 30 years of studying every shadow on the mountainside and every whisper of the wind through his wheat fields. Cedar Valley had been his family's home since his grandfather first broke ground here in 1932, and the McKinnon farm had grown from a modest 40 acres to a sprawling 200-acre operation that produced some of the finest organic crops in 3 counties. At 58, James had earned his reputation as the most meticulous farmer in the valley. His organic produce won regional awards, and younger farmers often sought his advice about crop rotation and soil management. There wasn't a plant, insect, or animal on his 200 acres that he couldn't identify with a quick glance. Even the local agricultural college occasionally sent students to learn from his sustainable farming practices. The McKinnon farmhouse stood proud on a gentle slope overlooking fields of golden wheat that stretched toward the distant mountains. Every morning, James would wake before dawn, pull on his worn leather boots, and head out to check on his crops, just as his father had taught him. He knew every inch of his land, from the rocky outcrop near the north fence where wild blackberries grew, to the natural spring that fed the irrigation system he'd designed himself. This October had been unusually warm, and James had delayed his harvest by 2 weeks to let the wheat reach perfect maturity. The decision had raised eyebrows among his neighbors, who stuck rigidly to traditional farming calendars, but James trusted his instincts. His deep connection to the land had never steered him wrong before. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn as James guided his combine through the wheat field. The familiar rumble of the machine and the steady swish of grain being harvested had always brought him peace. His wife, Martha, had passed away 3 years ago, and these solitary moments in the fields had become his sanctuary, a place where he could feel close to her memory and the lifetime they'd built together. Their daughter, Sarah, had moved to Seattle to become an environmental scientist, carrying on the family's love for nature in her own way. She called every Sunday, eager to hear about the farm and share stories of her research. James couldn't wait to tell her about this year's bumper crop. The wheat kernels were plump and golden, exactly the quality that had earned him his reputation. The morning wore on. James noticed something unusual about the way his combine was performing. The machine seemed to hesitate slightly every few yards, as if encountering something different from the usual wheat stalks. Most farmers might have dismissed it, but 3 decades of experience had taught James that even the smallest anomaly could be significant. He stopped the combine and climbed down to investigate. The wheat here looked different somehow. The stalks were bent in an unusual pattern, forming what almost looked like a protective canopy over something below. James knelt down, his knees creaking in protest, and gently pushed aside the wheat stalks. What he found hidden beneath made his heart skip a beat. There, nestled in a perfect circle of flattened wheat, lay 5 eggs, unlike anything he'd ever seen. Each was about the size of a football, with a shell that seemed to shift colors in the morning light, blues and greens swirling together like the northern lights he'd once seen on a trip to Alaska. The surface appeared smooth, but had a peculiar texture that reminded him of polished opal. James reached out with trembling fingers to touch one of the eggs. It was warm, warmer than it should have been after lying in the cool morning air. And there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He could have sworn he felt a subtle vibration, like a heartbeat, pulsing through the shell. For a man who prided himself on knowing every creature that called his farm home, this discovery was impossible to reconcile with his experience. These weren't from any local bird species. They were too large, too strange. They weren't snake eggs or turtle eggs either. In fact, they didn't match anything he'd ever encountered in his life of working the land. As James carefully gathered the eggs into his jacket, he knew his life was about to change. What he didn't know was just how much these mysterious objects would challenge everything he thought he knew about his peaceful corner of the world. The bell above Miller's general store chimed as James pushed through the door the next morning. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh-baked pastries filled the air, mingling with the low murmur of conversation from the usual crowd of farmers gathered for their morning ritual. For 40 years, this store had served as Cedar Valley's unofficial town hall, where local news spread faster than wildfire and farming wisdom was exchanged over steaming cups of Betty Miller's famous coffee. Today, James carried more than just his usual thermos. Wrapped carefully in an old quilted blanket, he'd brought one of the mysterious eggs to show his fellow farmers. He'd spent the entire night researching, poring over farming journals and wildlife guides, but found nothing that matched what he'd discovered. If anyone could help him make sense of this, it would be the collective knowledge gathered in this room. "Morning, James," called out Betty from behind the counter, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "You're later than usual today. Almost missed the morning rush." Her cheerful expression faltered slightly as she noticed the unusual bundle in his arms. The regular crowd was all there. Henry Thompson, whose dairy farm bordered James's property to the north. The Peterson brothers, who ran the valley's largest corn operation. And old Jack Warner, who'd been farming these parts longer than anyone else alive. They all looked up as James approached their usual table. "Gentlemen," James began, his voice slightly hesitant, "I found something strange in my wheat field yesterday, and I could use your thoughts on it." He carefully unwrapped the blanket, revealing the iridescent egg nestled within. The reaction was immediate. Henry Thompson nearly choked on his coffee, sputtering as he leaned forward to get a better look. Old Jack's bushy eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. The Peterson brothers exchanged skeptical glances. "What in tarnation is that supposed to be?" Henry asked, wiping coffee from his chin. "Some kind of art project? Sarah sending you modern art from the city?" A few chuckles rippled through the group. James shook his head, explaining how he'd found 5 such eggs hidden in his wheat field. As he described the discovery, the strange warmth of the eggs and their unusual coloring, the laughter around the table grew louder. "James, my friend," old Jack said, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder, "I've been farming for 63 years, and I've never seen anything like that because it ain't natural. Someone's playing a prank on you. Probably those teenagers from over in River Junction. They're always up to something." The Peterson brothers had pulled out their phones and were taking pictures, grinning as they typed. James could already imagine the social media post that would be circulating by lunchtime. "Look at the colors." Younger Peterson brother Mike snickered. "It's like something from one of those science fiction movies my kids watch. What do you think's gonna hatch? A baby alien?" The comment drew more laughter from the growing crowd of onlookers. Betty, who had come over to see what the commotion was about, tried to be more diplomatic. "It's certainly unique, James. But are you sure it's real? Maybe someone left them there as some kind of artistic statement about organic farming." James felt his face growing hot. He'd known these people his entire life, had shared equipment with them during tough times, celebrated bumper crops together, and helped each other through droughts and storms. Their dismissal stung more than he'd expected. "I found 5 of them," he repeated firmly. "They're warm to the touch, and there's something inside them. I can feel it moving." This declaration brought a fresh wave of laughter. Henry Thompson stood up, wiping tears from his eyes. "Moving," he says. "James, my friend, I think you've been spending too much time alone out there in those fields. First the delayed harvest, now mysterious eggs. What's next? Crop circles?" The morning gathering had turned into something of a spectacle, with people taking turns examining the egg and offering increasingly outlandish theories about its origin. Some suggested it was a failed art project. Others joked about government experiments. A few even started calling James the Egg Whisperer, a nickname he suspected would stick. As James carefully rewrapped the egg, he noticed old Jack watching him with an odd expression. The elderly farmer waited until the others had returned to their seats before speaking quietly. "You really believe these eggs are something special, don't you?" he asked, his voice low enough that only James could hear. James nodded. "I can't explain it, Jack, but in 30 years of farming, I've never seen anything like them. And there's something else." He hesitated before continuing. "Last night, I could have sworn I saw lights in the sky over my wheat field. Not like normal aircraft, something different." Old Jack's expression grew serious. "Be careful with talk like that, James. People around here don't take kindly to anything that challenges their view of the world. Whatever those eggs are, you might want to keep them to yourself for now." As James left Miller's that morning, the sound of laughter followed him out the door. He placed the egg carefully in his truck and sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. The ritual hurt, but it didn't shake his conviction. He knew what he'd found was real, and he was determined to find out exactly what these eggs were, no matter what anyone else thought. What he didn't realize was that his discovery was about to attract attention from far beyond the boundaries of Cedar Valley, and the questioning looks from his neighbors would soon be the least of his concerns. The drive home from Miller's seemed longer than usual, each mile marked by the weight of the morning's ridicule. But as James pulled up to his farmhouse, the sight of his greenhouse, a wedding gift from Martha 20 years ago, sparked an idea. If these eggs needed warmth and protection, he knew exactly where to provide it. The greenhouse stood at the edge of his property, its glass panels gleaming in the autumn sun. Martha had used it to grow her prized orchids, filling the space with delicate blooms that won ribbons at the county fair. Since her passing, it had mainly housed James's seedlings and winter vegetables. Now it would serve a very different purpose. Inside his house, James retrieved the other 4 eggs from where he'd carefully stored them in his late wife's quilting chest. Each one seemed to pulse with that same inner warmth, the iridescent shells casting dancing reflections on the walls. He gathered all his old thermometers, humidity gauges, and the space heater he used during winter storms. "What would you think of all this, Martha?" he murmured as he worked, remembering how she'd always supported his instincts, even when they seemed strange to others. She'd stood by him 15 years ago when he decided to go organic, despite the community's skepticism. Now her greenhouse would help him protect another controversial decision. James spent the afternoon transforming the greenhouse into what he hoped would be a suitable incubator. He cleared a central workbench, laying down soft hay in a careful nest formation. The space heater would maintain a constant temperature, and he set up a rotating series of thermometers to monitor conditions from every angle. A spare baby monitor from Sarah's childhood would alert him to any sounds or movements. As he worked, his phone kept buzzing with notifications. The Peterson brothers' social media posts had spread quickly through the farming community. Local Facebook groups were filled with jokes about McKinnon's mystery eggs and Cedar Valley's alien invasion. Someone had even created a meme featuring his face superimposed on a cartoon alien body. Around sunset, James noticed something peculiar. The eggs seemed to glow more intensely as darkness fell, their surface patterns shifting like oil on water. He quickly set up his old video camera on a tripod, determined to document everything. If these eggs were what he suspected, something entirely unknown to science, he wanted to record every detail. The ringing of his phone startled him. It was Sarah, calling a few days earlier than their usual Sunday chat. "Dad?" Her voice was concerned. "Are you okay? I've been seeing some strange posts about you on Facebook, something about eggs." James sighed, settling onto his old workstool. "I'm fine, honey, but I did find something unusual in the wheat field yesterday." He described the discovery, the egg's characteristics, and the community's reaction. To his relief, Sarah didn't laugh. "Send me pictures," she said instead, her scientist's curiosity evident in her voice. "Close-ups of the shell texture. And anything else unusual you notice? I can run them by some colleagues at the university. Quietly, of course." After sending Sarah detailed photographs, James settled in for his first night of egg-watching. He'd moved his old recliner into the greenhouse, along with a thermos of coffee and his farming journals. As darkness fell completely, the egg's glow became more pronounced, casting ethereal patterns on the greenhouse glass. Around midnight, something extraordinary happened. James had been dozing lightly when a soft humming sound woke him. All 5 eggs were vibrating slightly, their shells emanating a blue-green light that pulsed in perfect synchronization. He fumbled for his camera, hands shaking with excitement as he documented the phenomenon. The display lasted for exactly 7 minutes before fading. James checked his instruments. During the light show, the temperature around the eggs had increased by exactly 10 degrees before returning to normal. He wrote everything down in a new journal, one dedicated solely to observations of the eggs. As dawn approached, James realized he'd have to face the community again. There would be more jokes, more skeptical looks, more whispered comments about his sanity. But something told him these eggs were worth any amount of ridicule. He'd felt it the moment he'd found them, a certainty deep in his bones that he was witnessing something unprecedented. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. She'd shared the photos with a trusted colleague in the biology department. The response was intriguing. "These don't match any known species patterns. The shell structure appears to be entirely unique. Keep everything quiet and document everything. This could be significant." James smiled, feeling validated. He wasn't crazy. There was something truly extraordinary happening in his greenhouse, something that would prove all the skeptics wrong. He just had to be patient and vigilant. As the first rays of sun pierced the greenhouse glass, James made a decision. He would continue his regular farming routine, face the community's jokes with dignity, and dedicate himself to protecting these mysterious eggs until they hatched. Whatever emerged would vindicate his choice. He was sure of it. What he didn't know then was that the egg's nighttime display had been visible from the road, and curious eyes had already noticed the strange lights coming from the McKinnon greenhouse. The quiet protection he hoped for was about to become much more complicated. The following days brought a parade of uninvited visitors to the McKinnon farm. News of the glowing eggs had spread beyond Cedar Valley's borders, attracting curiosity. Seekers and self-proclaimed paranormal investigators. They parked along the road at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious lights that now regularly emanated from James's greenhouse. Local news vans had started appearing too, their reporters eager for a story about the eccentric farmer and his mysterious discovery. James refused all interviews, but that didn't stop them from filming his greenhouse from the road or interviewing his neighbors. The Peterson brothers were particularly eager to share their theories on camera, each one more outlandish than the last. "It's probably some kind of marketing stunt," Mike Peterson told a reporter from the county newspaper. "McKinnon's always been different with his organic farming. Maybe he's trying to drum up attention for some new eco-friendly fertilizer." The quote made the front page, accompanied by a blurry photo of the greenhouse glowing in the dark. The constant attention was taking its toll on James's daily routine. He'd had to install additional security cameras and motion sensors around the greenhouse after catching teenagers trying to sneak closer for photos. Every trip to Miller's general store now felt like running a gauntlet of whispered comments and barely concealed smirks. Even Sarah was feeling the pressure. She called one evening, her voice tense. "Dad, my department head asked me about you today. Someone connected our last names, and now there are rumors circulating in the scientific community. They're calling you the UFO farmer on some websites." James sat heavily in his greenhouse chair, watching the eggs pulse with their now familiar gentle rhythm. "I'm sorry, honey. I never meant to cause you any trouble. But you've seen the photos. You know this is something real, something important." "I know, Dad," Sarah sighed. "My colleague is fascinated by the shell structure. He says it doesn't match anything in any biological database. But we need to be careful. If these really are something unprecedented, there are people who might not have the best intentions." Her warning proved prophetic. The next morning, James received an unexpected visitor. A sleek black car pulled up his driveway, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out, introducing himself as Dr. Marcus Reynolds from a private research institute. "Mr. McKinnon," Reynolds said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We've been following your situation with great interest. Our facility has state-of-the-art equipment for studying biological anomalies. We'd like to purchase the eggs for study. Name your price." James felt a chill despite the warm autumn sun. "They're not for sale," he said firmly, "and I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property." Reynolds' smile disappeared. "Mr. McKinnon, be reasonable. You're a farmer, not a scientist. These eggs, whatever they are, belong in a proper research facility. We can offer you significant compensation, enough to modernize your entire operation." "The eggs stay here," James repeated, standing his ground. Reynolds left a business card before departing, but his visit left James deeply unsettled. That evening, old Jack Warner stopped by, bringing a casserole from his wife and a concerned expression. "James, people are talking about more than just eggs now. There's word going around about strange lights in the sky, unusual weather patterns. Some folks are saying you've brought something dangerous to our valley." James led his old friend to the greenhouse. The eggs were particularly active that evening, their shells rippling with waves of color. Old Jack stood in silence for several minutes, watching the display. "In all my years," he finally whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. Those aren't natural eggs, are they, James?" "I don't know what they are," James admitted, "but I know they were meant to be found, and I know they need protection. Whatever's inside them, it's growing. I can feel it." Old Jack nodded slowly. "You need to be careful, James. I heard about that fellow in the fancy car. He's not the first one asking questions about your farm, and he won't be the last. There are some powerful people who don't like mysteries they can't control." As if to emphasize his point, the eggs suddenly pulsed brighter, casting their ethereal light across both men's faces. Old Jack took an involuntary step back, crossing himself. "Martha always said you had a gift," he said quietly. "Said you could read the land like others read books. Maybe this is why. Maybe you were meant to find these things, protect them until whatever's going to happen, happens." After old Jack left, James sat alone in the greenhouse, contemplating his friend's words. The eggs had been in his care for nearly 2 weeks now, and the changes were becoming more pronounced. The shells seemed thinner, more translucent, and sometimes he could swear he saw shadows moving within them. His phone buzzed. Another message from Sarah. Her colleague had analyzed the latest photos and found something extraordinary. The eggs' shell structure appeared to be changing, evolving in a way that defied biological understanding. James looked at the 5 eggs, glowing softly in their nest of hay. Whatever was growing inside them, whatever had chosen his field as their resting place, he knew he would protect them until the end, no matter the cost to his reputation or peace of mind. What he didn't know was that Dr. Reynolds's visit had set larger forces in motion, and the quiet protection he'd maintained was about to face its greatest challenge yet. The morning fog hadn't yet lifted when James spotted 3 more black vehicles pulling up his driveway. Unlike Dr. Reynolds's sleek car, these were heavy-duty SUVs with government plates. A team of people in hazmat suits emerged, led by a stern-looking woman in a dark blue pantsuit who introduced herself as Dr. Eleanor Hayes from the Department of Agricultural Safety and Research. "Mr. McKinnon," she said, holding up official credentials, "we've received multiple reports about unidentified biological specimens on your property. Given the potential risks to local agriculture, we're here to conduct a mandatory inspection." James stood in his doorway, blocking the entrance. "Those eggs are under my protection. I have rights as a property owner." "We have a federal warrant," Dr. Hayes replied, producing a document. "This isn't a request, Mr. McKinnon. Either cooperate with our investigation, or we'll be forced to take more severe measures." Before James could respond, Sarah's truck came speeding up the driveway, gravel spraying from her tires. She jumped out, clutching a leather briefcase. "Dad, don't let them!" I brought help." Following close behind her was another car, from which emerged a distinguished-looking man, who introduced himself as Professor Thomas Chen, head of xenobiology at the State University. "Dr. Hayes," he called out, "I believe you'll find this interesting." He held up a document of his own, a research protection order granted last night by a federal judge. "The McKinnon specimens are now part of an ongoing university study. Your jurisdiction has been superseded." The tension in the air was palpable as Dr. Hayes reviewed the document. Her face darkened. "This isn't over," she warned, before ordering her team back to their vehicles. Once they'd left, Sarah hugged her father tightly. "I'm so sorry, Dad. When my colleague saw the latest data, he knew we had to act fast. He contacted Professor Chen, who's been studying unusual biological phenomena for decades. We drove all night to get here." Professor Chen was already heading toward the greenhouse, his eyes bright with excitement. "Mr. McKinnon, your daughter has shared some remarkable data with me. May I see them?" Inside the greenhouse, the eggs seemed to respond to the new presence, their glow intensifying. Professor Chen circled them slowly, taking measurements with strange devices. "Extraordinary," he muttered. "The energy signatures are unlike anything in our databases. And you say they were found in your wheat field?" James recounted the whole story, the discovery, the community's reaction, Dr. Reynolds's visit, and the bee eggs changing patterns. Professor Chen listened intently, taking detailed notes. "In my 40 years of research," he said finally, "I've documented 17 cases of unexplained biological phenomena, but nothing quite like this. These eggs, they're not just growing, they're communicating." "Communicating?" James and Sarah asked simultaneously. "The light patterns, the synchronized pulses, the temperature variations, it's all part of a complex system of information exchange. They're not just eggs, they're some kind of sophisticated biological transmission devices." As if in response to his words, the eggs began to pulse with a new pattern, rapid sequential flashes that sent shadows dancing across the greenhouse walls. Professor Chen rushed to set up additional monitoring equipment. "We need to protect them," Sarah insisted. "That woman from agricultural safety won't give up easily." "Already taken care of," Professor Chen assured them. "I've arranged for round-the-clock security disguised as a university research team. And my presence here will keep most government agencies at bay. My clearance level is higher than theirs." James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Finally, someone with authority believed him, understood the importance of his discovery. But as he watched Professor Chen fuss over his equipment, a new worry gnawed at him. "What happens when they hatch?" he asked quietly. Professor Chen paused in his work. Mr. McKinnon, whatever emerges from these eggs could change our understanding of life itself. The scientific community will want to study them intensively. They'll need to be moved to a secure facility. No, James cut him off firmly. They chose this place, this farm. They stay here. Professor Chen opened his mouth to argue, but Sarah stepped in. Dad's right. Whatever's in those eggs responded to him, chose him as their protector. We study them here, on his terms. The professor looked between father and daughter, then nodded, slowly. Very well. We'll set up a proper research station here, but Mr. McKinnon, you need to understand that what's growing in those eggs, it could be beyond anything we've ever encountered. Are you prepared for that responsibility? James looked at the eggs, remembering the moment he'd found them, the instant connection he'd felt. I've been preparing my whole life, he said quietly. I just didn't know it until now. As the three of them began planning the conversion of his greenhouse into a proper research facility, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not just by the curious locals or government agencies, but by something else, something that had entrusted him with a mystery that was only beginning to unfold. The eggs pulsed softly in their nest, their glow seeming to acknowledge the new protectors, who had joined their first guardian. The hatching was coming soon. James could feel it in his bones. And when it happened, he knew nothing in Cedar Valley would ever be the same again. The transformation of James's greenhouse into a sophisticated research station happened almost overnight. Professor Chen's team worked efficiently, installing, monitoring equipment worth more than James's entire farm, while maintaining the careful environmental conditions he'd established for the eggs. Local reaction to the sudden influx of university personnel was mixed. The Peterson brothers drove by regularly, filming the activity on their phones and posting conspiracy theories online. But old Jack had become a regular visitor, sitting quietly in a corner of the greenhouse, watching the eggs with an almost reverent expression. Never thought I'd see the day, he mused one evening as James checked the latest readouts. McKinnon's farm becoming a scientific landmark. Martha would have loved this. James smiled, remembering how his late wife had always encouraged his unconventional ideas. The eggs seemed especially active tonight, their shells now so translucent that shadows of movement were clearly visible within. Professor Chen's equipment recorded everything: temperature fluctuations, energy emissions, and what he called biorhythmic patterns. The internal movement is becoming more coordinated, Sarah explained, showing James the latest data on her tablet. Whatever's in there, they're getting ready. Professor Chen thinks it could be any day now. The news had energized the research team, but it also brought new concerns. Security around the greenhouse had been tightened after several attempts by unauthorized persons to get closer looks. Dr. Hayes's department had filed appeals against the research protection order, and Dr. Reynolds had been seen in town asking questions at Miller's general store. That night, James couldn't sleep. He sat in his usual chair in the greenhouse, watching the eggs pulse with their otherworldly light. The monitoring equipment hummed softly, recording every flutter and glow. Around midnight, something changed. The eggs' usual blue-green luminescence shifted to a deeper, more intense purple. James leaned forward, noticing how the shadows within seemed more defined, more purposeful in their movements. He was reaching for the emergency contact button when all 5 eggs began to vibrate in unison. Professor Chen arrived within minutes, still pulling on his lab coat. Extraordinary, he breathed, rushing to check his instruments. The energy readings are off the scale. This is it, Mr. McKinnon. They're beginning the final phase. Sarah arrived next, followed by several research assistants. The greenhouse quickly filled with excited whispers and the beeping of various instruments. Through it all, James sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the eggs. He could feel it. A building. Tension in the air, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. The eggs' vibration increased, their shells now pulsing with rapid waves of color. The shadows within became more distinct, pressing against the increasingly transparent shells. Temperature readings climbed steadily, and a high-pitched hum filled the air. "Everyone back," Professor Chen ordered suddenly. "The outer shells are beginning to phase shift. We don't know what kind of energy discharge might—" He was cut off by a brilliant flash of light that filled the greenhouse, momentarily blinding everyone. When James's vision cleared, he gasped. The eggs had changed completely. Their shells now looked like crystal, refracting light in impossible ways. Through the crystalline shells, they could now clearly see what was moving inside. Sarah grabbed her father's hand, squeezing it tightly. The shapes were unlike anything they'd ever seen. Not birds, not reptiles, but something altogether different. "Dad," Sarah whispered, "what are they?" Before James could respond, the first egg began to crack. Not like a normal egg. Instead, the crystalline shell seemed to dissolve, creating an opening through which emerged. The entire greenhouse fell, silent. Even Professor Chen's ever-present instruments seemed to quiet in that moment. What they were witnessing defied explanation. The creature was small, about the size of a house cat, but its form seemed to shift and change as they watched, its skin iridescent like the original eggs. One by one, the other eggs began to open in the same way. 5 creatures, each slightly different in coloring but clearly of the same species, emerged into the world. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes, seemed to glow with an inner intelligence. The first creature turned its gaze directly to James. In that moment, he felt a connection that went beyond anything he could explain, a sense of recognition, of rightness. Tears began streaming down his face as he realized what he'd been protecting all these weeks. Professor Chen was frantically taking readings, muttering about unprecedented biological architecture and completely new classification of life. But James barely heard him. He was focused entirely on the 5 creatures that were now moving toward him with graceful, fluid movements. The lead creature made a sound, not quite a chirp, not quite a hum, and the others responded in harmony. The resulting melody was hauntingly beautiful, filling the greenhouse with what felt like pure emotion. "They're thanking you," old Jack's voice came from the doorway. No one had noticed him arrive. "They chose you, James. They chose your land, your protection, and you didn't let them down." Sarah was already documenting everything with trembling hands, but she too was crying. "Dad," she managed to say, "you were right. All along, you were right." James couldn't speak. The creatures had reached him now, gathering around his chair like curious children. Their bodies gave off a gentle warmth, and their presence filled him with a profound sense of peace. He understood now why they had appeared. In his field, why they had trusted him with their protection during their most vulnerable time. As the sun began to rise over Cedar Valley, news of the hatching spread quickly. The world would soon descend on the McKinnon farm, demanding answers, seeking explanations. But for now, in the quiet of his greenhouse, James sat surrounded by 5 impossible creatures that had chosen him as their guardian, and he knew that everything, all the ridicule, all the doubt, all the sleepless nights, had been worth it. The creatures hummed their ethereal melody, and James McKinnon, the farmer who had trusted his instincts against all odds, wept with joy at the miracle. He had helped bring into the world. News of the hatching spread through Cedar Valley like wildfire. By sunrise, a crowd had gathered at the edge of James's property, held back by the university security team. News vans lined the road, their satellite dishes reaching skyward, broadcasting the first glimpses of the transformed greenhouse that now glowed with a soft, pulsating light from within. The Peterson brothers were among the first locals to arrive, their usual mockery replaced by stunned silence as they witnessed the otherworldly glow. Even Dr. Hayes had returned, this time accompanied by higher-ranking government officials who stood at the property line, engaged in intense discussions with Professor Chen. Inside the greenhouse, James hadn't moved from his chair. The 5 creatures continued their gentle exploration of their new environment, moving with a grace that seemed to defy physics. Their bodies shifted colors in response to their surroundings, sometimes becoming almost transparent, other times blazing with brilliant patterns that danced across their skin. "The readings are extraordinary," Sarah whispered, careful not to disturb the peaceful scene. "Their cellular structure. It's like nothing we've ever seen. They're not just adapting to our environment, they're somehow harmonizing with it." "Professor." Chen nodded enthusiastically, his scientific detachment momentarily forgotten as one of the creatures approached his monitoring equipment with curious interest. "Look at how they process information. These aren't just animals. They're displaying signs of advanced intelligence. The way they communicate through light and sound patterns, it's beyond anything in our current understanding of evolution." James barely heard their scientific discussion. He was focused on the smallest of the 5 creatures, which hadn't left. His side, since emerging from its egg, its eyes, ever-changing pools of color, seemed to hold ancient wisdom. When it made its melodic humming sound, James could almost understand it, not in words, but in feelings, images, and impressions. "They're not just random mutations or undiscovered species," he said quietly. "They chose this place. They chose us." As if confirming his words, all 5 creatures turned to him in unison, their bodies pulsing with a soft, golden light. Old Jack, who had been watching silently from his corner, suddenly spoke up. "Remember that light we all saw in the sky last harvest? The one everyone said was just the northern lights playing tricks? Maybe we were being visited. Maybe they were looking for the right place, the right person." Sarah's scientific mind wanted to dismiss such speculation, but after what she'd witnessed, she couldn't. "Dad," she said, reviewing her data, "the energy signatures these beings are emitting, they match exactly with the anomalous readings our satellites detected during that light show last year." Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Local farmers, who had once laughed at James, now stood in reverent silence, watching the greenhouse pulse with otherworldly light. Betty Miller had arrived from the general store, carrying trays of coffee and pastries for the security team, her usual cheerful chatter subdued by the magnitude of what was happening. Dr. Hayes finally approached the greenhouse door, flanked by her superiors. Professor Chen met them outside, engaging in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Through the glass, James could see Chen gesturing emphatically, pointing to his research credentials and the legal documents protecting the site. The creatures seemed aware of the confrontation. The largest of them moved to the greenhouse wall, facing the officials, its body changing to emit a pattern of lights that rippled through the air. The government team took several steps back, their expressions a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "They're protecting us," Sarah realized, checking her instruments. "That light pattern, it's creating some kind of energy field. They're making it clear this is their chosen sanctuary." James smiled, remembering all the nights he'd spent protecting the eggs, and now understanding that he had been chosen for a purpose far greater than he'd imagined. These beings, whatever they were, hadn't just randomly appeared in his wheat field. They had selected him, tested him, and trusted him with their most vulnerable moment. The smallest creature made its musical sound again, and this time James felt something new, a sense of purpose, of future possibilities. Images flashed through his mind, his fields flourishing with unprecedented abundance, new forms of growth and healing, harmony between earth and sky. "They're not just visitors," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They're teachers. They're here to show us something about life itself." Professor Chen's equipment suddenly lit up with new readings as all 5 creatures began to glow more intensely. The greenhouse filled with patterns of light that seemed to dance in the air, forming complex geometric shapes that shifted and flowed. "It's a language," Sarah breathed, frantically documenting everything. "They're not just communicating, they're showing us their knowledge, their understanding of life and energy and growth." Outside, the sun had fully risen over Cedar Valley, its light mixing with the supernatural glow from the greenhouse. The crowd had grown silent, sensing that they were witnessing something profound, something that would change their understanding of life and their place in the universe forever. James McKinnon, the farmer who had trusted his instincts against all odds, sat surrounded by beings from beyond the stars, knowing that his simple act of protecting 5 strange eggs had opened a door to possibilities beyond imagination. The ridicule, the doubt, the sleepless nights, all of it had led to this moment of vindication and wonder. The creatures hummed their ethereal melody, and Cedar Valley would never be the same again. Within days, the McKinnon farm had become the center of worldwide attention. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras trying to capture glimpses of the extraordinary beings that had emerged from the mysterious eggs. Scientists from every major research institution clamored for access, while government agencies maintained a constant presence at the property boundaries. James, however, remained steadfast in his role as protector. With Professor Chen's backing and Sarah's expertise, he established strict protocols for any interaction with the creatures. The greenhouse, now dubbed the Sanctuary by the research team, remained a carefully controlled environment where the beings could feel safe and continue their remarkable displays of intelligence. "Mr. McKinnon," a reporter called out during one of his rare press appearances, "how does it feel to be the man who discovered alien life?" James shook his head slowly. "I didn't discover them," he replied. "They discovered us. They chose this place, this land. I was just fortunate enough to understand they needed protection. The creatures, which the scientific community had begun calling luminous sapients, due to their intelligent use of light for communication, had developed a clear routine. Each morning they would gather around James as he made his usual inspection of the greenhouse, their bodies shifting through colors that Professor Chen's team had begun to recognize as emotional expressions. "The bond they've formed with your father is unprecedented," Professor Chen explained to Sarah one morning as they reviewed the latest data. "It's as if they imprinted on him during their incubation period. They seem to recognize him as both guardian and student. Indeed, the beings had begun sharing what could only be described as knowledge. Through their intricate light patterns and harmonious sounds, they communicated complex information about energy, growth, and the interconnectedness of living systems. Sarah's research team worked tirelessly to decode and document these teachings. The impact on the local community had been profound. The Peterson brothers had transformed from skeptics to devoted believers, now serving as voluntary security aides. Jack had taken on the role of unofficial historian, documenting every detail of the being's daily activities in a worn leather journal. Even Dr. Hayes had undergone a change of heart. After witnessing the creature's peaceful intentions and extraordinary intelligence, she had become an advocate for their protection, using her government influence to ensure the sanctuary remained undisturbed. "It's remarkable," she admitted to James during one of her regular visits. "When I first came here, I thought we were dealing with a potential agricultural threat. Now I understand we're witnessing the beginning of something revolutionary." The creature's influence extended beyond their immediate environment. Farmers from neighboring properties reported unprecedented crop growth and soil rejuvenation. The light patterns emanating from the greenhouse seemed to have a beneficial effect on all living things within its radius. One morning, as James sat In his usual spot in the greenhouse, the smallest of the creatures approached him with particular purpose. Its body glowed with a new pattern, one that sent the research team's instruments into a frenzy of activity. "Dad!" Sarah called out, examining. "The readings, something's different. The energy signatures, they're changing." The creature extended what appeared to be an appendage, gently touching James's hand. In that moment, his mind filled with vivid images, vast fields of crops growing in perfect harmony with their environment, new forms of sustainable energy, healing technologies beyond current human understanding. "They're not just showing us," James gasped, overwhelmed by the vision. "They're teaching us how to achieve it." Professor Chen's team worked frantically to document everything as the other creatures joined in, their combined light patterns creating a three-dimensional display of information that filled the greenhouse. Sarah realized they were witnessing the transmission of advanced ecological knowledge that could transform human understanding of agriculture and environmental conservation. The news spread quickly. Agricultural companies offered massive contracts for exclusive access to the being's knowledge. Government agencies proposed classified research programs, but James, supported by Sarah and Professor Chen, stood firm in his conviction that this knowledge was meant for all humanity. "These beings chose a simple farm in Cedar Valley," he told the gathered press. "They didn't appear at a major research facility or government installation. They came here to this community to show us that the solutions to our greatest challenges might be simpler than we imagine if we're willing to learn and listen." As the world gradually came to terms with the reality of the luminous sapience, James McKinnon's role evolved from ridiculed farmer to respected guardian of extraordinary wisdom. The creatures continued their daily teachings, each session revealing new insights into sustainable living and ecological harmony. The greenhouse, once a simple structure for growing vegetables, had become a beacon of hope and discovery. And at its center, James sat contentedly in his old chair, surrounded by beings from beyond the stars, knowing that his trust in the unknown had led to something far greater than he could have ever imagined. The creatures hummed their ethereal melody, their bodies pulsing with colors that spoke of future possibilities, and James McKinnon smiled, understanding that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. 3 months after the hatching, Cedar Valley had transformed from a quiet farming community into a global center for ecological innovation. The knowledge shared by the luminous sapients had sparked a revolution in sustainable agriculture, and James's farm had become a living laboratory where ancient wisdom met modern science. Each morning, before the research teams arrived and the daily demonstrations began, James would spend quiet time alone with the creatures in the greenhouse. These peaceful moments reminded him of the early days when they were just mysterious eggs, and he was their sole protector. The smallest one, which Sarah had nicknamed Pioneer due to its tendency to initiate new learning sessions, still never strayed far from his side. "They've grown," old Jack commented one morning, watching the beings move through their increasingly complex light patterns. The creatures had indeed developed, their forms now slightly larger and their abilities more pronounced. Their communication had evolved too, becoming more sophisticated as they learned to bridge the gap between their consciousness and human understanding. "Remember when everyone thought I was crazy?" James asked, smiling at his old friend. "Now, look at us." He gestured to the scene outside the greenhouse, where teams of scientists worked alongside farmers, implementing the revolutionary growing techniques they'd learned from their otherworldly teachers. The results were undeniable. Fields that had once struggled to produce enough for a single season now yielded 3 times the crop with minimal resource input. The soil, enriched by methods the beings had demonstrated, showed unprecedented levels of fertility. Even the local, Wildlife seemed to thrive in the harmonious environment that had developed around the sanctuary. Sarah had established a permanent research station, working with Professor Chen to document and analyze every aspect of the being's teachings. Their latest project involved studying the unique energy field that the creatures generated, which seemed to promote healing and growth in all living things it touched. "Dad," she called out, rushing into the greenhouse one morning, "you need to see this." She held up her tablet, displaying complex data readings. "We've finally decoded one of their larger light pattern sequences. It's incredible." The patterns, it turned out, contained detailed information about atmospheric restoration and climate stabilization. The beings weren't just teaching better farming methods. They were sharing knowledge that could help heal the planet's damaged ecosystems. As this news spread, the pressure on Cedar Valley intensified. Environmental organizations, government agencies, and private corporations all sought access to the beings and their knowledge. But the creatures remained selective about what they shared and how they shared it, always working through James as their primary interpreter. "They understand more than we realize," James explained to a frustrated group of corporate representatives. "They're not here to provide quick fixes or profitable patents. They're here to teach us how to live in harmony with our world." The beings confirmed this understanding one evening with a display that left even the most skeptical observers speechless. As the sun set, all 5 creatures gathered in the center of the greenhouse, their bodies synchronizing in a dance of light and color that transformed the space into a living symphony of energy. Through this display, they shared a vision of Earth's potential future, cities integrated seamlessly with nature, agriculture that enhanced rather than depleted the environment, and human technology evolved to work in perfect harmony with natural systems. "It's not just about farming," Sarah realized, watching the demonstration with tears in her eyes. "They're showing us a path forward for all of humanity." The Peterson brothers, who had become regular fixtures at the farm, nodded in agreement. "Who would have thought," Mike Peterson mused, "that the biggest change in human history would start right here in Cedar Valley, with a farmer who was brave enough to trust his instincts?" James felt Pioneer brush against his hand, sharing a feeling of approval and purpose. The creature's touch brought back memories of those first days after finding the eggs, the certainty he'd felt despite the ridicule, the deep knowing that he was protecting something extraordinary. Dr. Hayes, who now served as the government's chief liaison to the sanctuary, had developed a deep respect for both James and the beings. "We were so wrong," she admitted one day. "We thought we were coming to contain a potential threat. Instead, we found teachers who could help us save ourselves." As the beings continued their daily lessons, their influence spread far beyond Cedar Valley. Farmers from around the world made pilgrimages to learn their methods. Scientists studied their teachings and developed new technologies based on their principles. And slowly, the way humans thought about their relationship with the earth began to change. The greenhouse, now expanded and enhanced but still centered around James's old chair, had become a symbol of hope for a better future. The creatures moved freely within its space, their bodies shimmering with colors that spoke of possibility and promise. James McKinnon, once mocked as the crazy farmer who talked to eggs, was now recognized as the guardian of humanity's greatest teachers. But he remained humble, understanding that he had simply been in the right place at the right time, with the wisdom to trust in something extraordinary. The beings hummed their ethereal melody, and Cedar Valley continued to transform, one lesson at a time, into a model for a new way of living in harmony with the natural world. 1 year after the hatching, James sat in his familiar chair in the greenhouse, watching as Pioneer demonstrated a new light pattern to a group of visiting scientists. The being's body shimmered with colors that still took his breath away. Even after all this time, The small creature that had first touched his hand had grown into a magnificent teacher, its wisdom touching lives across the globe. "Dad," Sarah called, entering the greenhouse with her tablet, "you're not going to believe the latest satellite images." She pulled up a series of photographs showing Cedar Valley from above. The transformation was stunning. What had once been a patchwork of traditional farms had become a harmonious tapestry of sustainable agriculture, with James's farm at its radiant center. The luminous sapients had changed everything. Their teachings had spread far beyond farming, influencing fields from medicine to renewable energy. The light patterns they generated had been found to have healing properties, and hospitals around the world were now implementing what they called luminous therapy, with remarkable results. Remember when the Peterson brothers used to make alien jokes? Old Jack chuckled, joining them in the greenhouse. At 93, he was still the sanctuary's most faithful visitor, documenting every new development in his ever-growing collection of journals. Now look at them, teaching these methods in universities. Indeed, Mike Peterson had become one of the leading advocates for the being's agricultural techniques, traveling the world to help implement their sustainable farming practices. His brother had established a research foundation dedicated to studying the creature's unique form of energy manipulation. Dr. Hayes, who now headed a new international organization focused on implementing the being's ecological knowledge, arrived for her weekly update. "The results continue to exceed all expectations," she reported. "Regions that adopted these methods are seeing unprecedented improvements in soil quality and crop yields, and the environmental impact, it's like watching the earth heal itself." Professor Chen's research team had expanded to include experts from every scientific discipline. They had recently made a breakthrough in understanding the creature's complex language of light and sound, discovering that it contained mathematical principles that could revolutionize human technology. "It's not just about the information they're sharing," Sarah explained, reviewing the latest data. "They're teaching us to think differently, to see the interconnectedness of all living systems. Every pattern, every sound they make contains layers of meaning we're still uncovering." As if to demonstrate this point, all 5 beings suddenly gathered in the center of the greenhouse, their bodies synchronizing in a new configuration. The resulting light display was unlike anything they'd shown before. A spiral of energy that seemed to pulse with the very rhythm of life itself. James felt Pioneer's familiar touch on his hand, and his mind filled with images of the future. Not just of Cedar Valley or even Earth, but of humanity's potential place in a vast, interconnected cosmos. He understood then that the being's arrival had been more than just a random event. It was part of a larger pattern, a cosmic dance of growth and evolution. "They're not just teaching us about farming or ecology," he said softly. "They're showing us our place in the universe." The greenhouse, which had witnessed so much over the past year, had become a symbol of hope for people around the world. Visitors came from every corner of the globe, drawn by the promise of wisdom that could help heal their lands and communities. Each one left changed, carrying with them not just knowledge, but a new way of seeing the world. Betty Miller, who still brought coffee and pastries every morning, summed it up best. "It's like the whole valley is glowing now, and not just from their lights. There's something in the air, in the soil, in people's hearts. We're all part of something bigger than ourselves." The creatures had grown too, their forms now more intricate, their abilities more profound. Yet they remained gentle teachers, patient with human limitations, always finding new ways to bridge the gap between their advanced understanding and Earth's developing consciousness. James often thought back to that first morning in his wheat field, when he'd discovered the strange eggs that would change everything. The ridicule he'd faced, the doubt, the sleepless nights, all of it had led to this moment, this transformation that was spreading across the planet like ripples in a pond. "You were right all along," Sarah told him, squeezing his hand. "You knew they were special from the very beginning." Pioneer moved closer, its body pulsing with colors that James had learned to recognize as affection and approval. The being's presence reminded him of Martha, of how she would have loved to see all of this. Somehow he felt she knew that she had been watching over him throughout this extraordinary journey. As the sun set over Cedar Valley, casting long shadows through the greenhouse glass, the beings began their evening symphony, a harmonious blend of light and sound that seemed to connect earth and sky. The research teams had long since learned to step back during these moments, understanding that some things went beyond scientific measurement. James McKinnon, the farmer who had once been mocked for protecting strange eggs, sat contentedly among beings from the stars, watching as their light transformed the world, one heart at a time. The creatures hummed their ethereal melody, and in that sound was the promise of a future brighter than anyone had dared to imagine. The legacy of those 5 mysterious eggs would continue to unfold, touching lives, healing lands, and showing humanity a path toward harmony with the cosmic dance of life itself. And it had all begun with a farmer who dared to believe in something extraordinary. One crisp autumn morning, exactly 2 years after the eggs first appeared in his wheat field, James stood in the greenhouse surrounded by all 5 luminous sapients. The air thrummed with an unusual energy, and even the scientists had noticed something different in the being's behavior that day. Pioneer, now nearly twice its original size, approached James with a luminescence more intense than ever before. The other 4 creatures formed a circle around them, their bodies pulsing in perfect synchronization. Professor Chen's instruments were recording unprecedented energy readings, while Sarah watched with tears in her eyes, somehow knowing they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Dad," she whispered, "look at their pattern. It's like nothing we've seen before." The beings began to glow with increasing intensity, their light filling the greenhouse with swirling colors that seemed to bend reality itself. Pioneer reached out and touched James's hand, and in that moment he understood. They were preparing to leave. Through their connection, Pioneer shared a final vision, one of countless other worlds, other civilizations, all part of a grand cosmic dance of learning and growth. The beings hadn't just come to teach, they had come to prepare humanity for its next step in universal awareness. Old Jack, who had arrived early that morning drawn by some inexplicable instinct, spoke softly from his corner. "They always knew. This day would come, didn't they, James? They were never meant to stay forever." The light show intensified, and now the beings' bodies seemed to shimmer between solid form and pure energy. But before their transformation completed, they had one final gift to share. The greenhouse filled with patterns more complex and beautiful than any they'd shown before, and every person present felt their consciousness expand with new understanding. Professor Chen's equipment recorded everything, but the true gift was being written directly into the hearts and minds of those present. It was a complete template for humanity's potential, a roadmap for evolution that would take generations to fully understand and implement. "They're not abandoning us," James realized, feeling Pioneer's last touch. "They're graduating us. We're ready to continue on our own." Sarah's instruments captured the final moments as the 5 beings transformed into pure light, their bodies becoming one with the energy they had always wielded so beautifully. The greenhouse filled with a warm, golden glow that seemed to pulse with love and promise. When the light finally faded, the beings were gone, but they had left their mark on every plant, every particle of soil, every heart they had touched. The greenhouse still hummed with their energy, and the knowledge they had shared remained, a gift that would continue to transform the world. Dr. Hayes, who had rushed to the farm when the energy readings began to spike, stood in awe. They've encoded their complete teachings into the cellular structure of everything in this valley, she announced, reading the incoming data. Their knowledge will continue to grow and evolve with us. James sat in his old chair, tears flowing freely down his face. He remembered the days of mockery, the nights of uncertainty, the moment of triumph when the eggs had hatched. All of it had led to this, not an ending, but a new beginning. The Peterson brothers, who had arrived just in time to witness the being's departure, approached James with respect. "Thank you," Mike said simply, "for believing when none of us would." Old Jack opened his final journal, his hands trembling slightly. "The day the light beings returned to the stars," he wrote, "was the day humanity truly began to understand its place in the universe." Sarah hugged her father tightly. "They chose well," she whispered. "They chose you, Dad, and because of that choice, everything has changed." As word of the being's departure spread, people gathered at the farm, drawn by a need to be close to the place where it had all began. The greenhouse continued to pulse with a subtle light, a reminder of the extraordinary teachers who had shared their wisdom with humanity. James McKinnon stood in his wheat field one last time that evening, looking up at the stars. The beings were out there somewhere, perhaps seeking other worlds, other students ready to learn. But their greatest gift remained, the knowledge that humanity was not alone, and that the universe was full of wonders for those brave enough to believe. The legacy of the 5 strange eggs would live on in the transformed lands of Cedar Valley, in the new ways of farming that spread across the globe, in the hearts of all those who had witnessed something miraculous. And it had all begun with one farmer who dared to trust his instincts and protect something he didn't understand. As the sun set over Cedar Valley one final time in our story, its light seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary things can happen in the most ordinary places if we just have the courage to believe.